This is Cow, the podcast. Yeah, hi there. Welcome to Cow, the podcast online, taking you on a trip into the strange and wonderful landscape of this here Cow, the podcast. This week, delving into linguistics, how language shapes what we think, and some of the linguistic traps that we all fall into, getting in the way of clear thinking, generally causing trouble. Want to know where it's all going wrong, what you've been up to? All of us. Well, I'm Ant Biggs, and I'll be your host for the next 20 to 30 minutes or so. Stay with me. If you're a regular listener and you're feeling generous, thinking maybe this podcast could use my support, you can find out how to go about that at cowthepodcast.online. Thank you to those who are supporting us right now. Without you, we couldn't do this. And if you want to come by and comment or just say hello, same place, cowthepodcast.online. See you there. Okay, so this week, back into the realms of philosophy, or at least looking at stuff. Of course, there's not everybody will even accept that looking at stuff, or even trying to understand stuff, is a good idea. And that's going to throw anyone for a while, but that's not what we do here. And if you want to question why we do it, say, what's the point? Well, at that level, it's because it makes me feel better to do so. That's the bottom line. But we're leaving that level of discourse there, of course, to go just a little deeper. Here comes the rabbit hole. So bear with me. I'm about to take a few leaps of faith here, jump into a number of assumptions from the off, primarily that philosophy has this job to do, and that job is to question the nature of reality, the meaning of life, to question how things are constructed, to seek to understand the human condition. Now, this kind of questioning has been around for thousands of years. There's something fundamental about curiosity and creativity, and of evolutionary value in discovering new truths. Or perhaps we could say new landscapes, new opportunities. And it might seem that a good amount of this kind of questioning can be answered by science, and we can look around and get plenty of support for that idea. Living, for example, as we do in Western society, we live by technology, and our faith is in science to fix these problems, so that science has for many taken the place of a religion, and there's been a rise in scientific dogma. In simple parallels to Christian arguments for child poverty, science is good, and science is all we need. But it's a mistake to believe that science has all of the answers. And at the core of this are value judgments, and at the core of this are questions of how we're interpreting what we see. While science can answer what and can spend billions of pounds in doing so, can it really answer why? There are those famous and reputable scientists who argue that we now know everything that we can ever know about matter, that the Higgs experiment was not about discovering a new particle. It was not about any deeper exploration of this miniaturized space. It wasn't about stumbling into one of these things. The work of CERN was to prove how to make a Higgs. It was to prove that the mechanisms of particle existence were understood well enough so that we could make a particle that shouldn't exist. Anything we can imagine now, we can make it. Anything else out there, dark matter for example, will never be known. It's there, okay, we can know that, but we can't interact with it. It's out of our range. This is the end of the road. But that argument is really only one particular reductionist narrative that's reached its end. The search for meaning through the discovery of fundamental building blocks of reality, the narrative of physics. And adding to the conversation are those who are less scientifically qualified, maybe. And by that, I guess I'm pointing a finger at the dangers of this scientific dogma, that it's not all we know. And these people are challenging that view, that this is all we can know. Pointing towards other narratives, to narratives where we don't expect to find our answers in the turning cogs, where we must continue a search for new phenomena whilst the gears of a clockwork universe continue to grind on. These are narratives in which the fundamentals of existence are pure mathematics, evolutionary life force, their consciousness of mind, their meaning, information even. Again, all of them taken from the theories of respected physicists such as Stephen Hawking, Einstein, names you'll know, and theories which are beginning to take hold. We live in a multiverse, perhaps, a simulation. We live in the matrix. I explored this in a conversation that was held between physicist Sean Carroll and the Buddhist scholar Alan Wallace in episode 4, What's Real, What's Not, and So What? But to move on, seeing scientists battling with their own versions of the truth, in conversation about which theories are more appropriate than others and which are more important. To see this is to see science in action, to see theories raised and critiqued, to see memes generating and evolving in a natural evolution, demonstrating survival of the fittest maybe. But it's also to see scientists themselves indulging in the same epic, egotistical evolutionary traps that challenge all of us every day. Our basic struggle for hierarchical dominance and for status, and the meme of science, the ideas themselves in competition, in tension between the old guard and a paradigm shift. This is where new ideas have to prove themselves against an old guard, like rutting stags. The nature of science is that a theory stands out until it's proven wrong or inadequate, and people have lives and careers. They have the chance of immortality, and also billions of dollars invested in the scientific establishment. It isn't easy to challenge that. I'm not saying this tension is bad, it's good, because we get our rigor out of that. But are we sure the balance is right? Does it move quick enough? Now, I can go on with the need for change, for paradigm shift, and not just in science, but in everything. But I'm not going to do that today. We're leaving out all the bad stuff for a change. Maybe it must be some kind of New Year feeling going on at time of writing, but I'm sure we'll get back to that. But this is about how we recognize how we get distracted from the scientific or the objective methods, even as scientists or science fans, and especially how we relate that to our everyday lives and our investments in the future. How what we think and how we get there is expressed throughout culture, and how that can be a prison. I guess I just gave an example found in physics, and I shouldn't conflate all forms of science together. For the record, though, I'm a science fan, and I'm going to come right out and say that right now, that the scientific method rocks. Just suppose, though, something more fundamental than physics. And now let me rewind to the point I made about how physics becomes a hierarchical struggle. This is life force getting involved. This is evolution. Maybe this is a struggle for the control of the narrative. Let's unpack that a bit. I'm going to take a bit of a sidestep here and look at how we communicate our ideas. Take a look at how we use language, because surely this is fundamental to thought. In science, just like any other subject that we take on, this is about an underlying narrative, about the stuff that underlies everything we hold sacred, be that physics or religion or love, existence, beauty or truth. We're exploring ideas, discovering ideas, changing minds, and evolving what we think. This is a cultural and a social thing, not just personal, and that's how it's done. And it becomes obvious that we think, and it becomes obvious that what we think has to bear some relation to how we communicate it. We need to communicate clearly, and maybe we're okay to assume that our everyday language is up to the job, but maybe not. What if we were using a different language? In a TED Talk, How Language Shapes the Way We Think by Lera Boroditsky, she talks about these differences and what it can mean for us. She says, the beauty of linguistic diversity is that it reveals to us just how ingenious and how flexible the human mind is. Boroditsky says, human minds have invented not one cognitive universe, but 7,000. And each of them communicates. She uses the example of putting a jellyfish in a library, thinking about quantum physics, into your head. And there it is. I've passed it on. Yes, there are different ways of doing it, different structures. So do those different structures make a difference? Does the way we communicate dictate the way we think? And what does that mean for us? What does it mean for the language of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic science? There's an acronym for you, weird science. Boroditsky talks of an Aboriginal language that talks only in cardinal direction, not relative. That means there's no left or right, there's only north, south, east and west, and all the points in between, of course. But the Kukacha, they greet each other by saying where they're going, and they refer to their own limbs as being in a specific direction. They say there's an ant on your southwest leg, not on your left leg. And the result is that they have a continual sense of where they are in their environment, of course, where their friends are. Another example she uses is to point out that English speakers, and presumably some speakers of other languages, will order time from left to right. Given a number of pictures taken over time, of a face, for example, aging, we'll put the earliest one on the left and read time from left to right. In Hebrew or Aramaic, time would be read in the opposite direction. And in Chinese, it would be read from top to bottom. The Kukacha tribe, however, align the images with the path of the sun. However the images are presented to them, they always line them up from east to west, from where the sun rises to where it sets. Independent of where they're sat, the direction they're sitting in, time for the Kukacha is not centered on the self, but exists in an external universe. And furthermore, there are languages in which we learn the linguistic trick of counting, English of course. But there are languages where numbers are not learned, they don't exist. No numbers, no science. A world without maths. And vision, so fundamental to human activity, is provably manipulated by language. It only makes sense once filtered or translated into reality by language. One language has only the concept of light and dark, for example, no colour. Interesting, perhaps, that the whole spectrum can be described as binary. But others have many words for many colours, like Eskimos having a legendary 40 words for snow. Or in Russia, where there are 2 different types of blue. For a Russian observer, light blue and dark blue are separate colours. And this can be measured. When brain activity is measured in response to different colour stimuli, essentially when colours are seen to change, their brain sparks up. The word boundaries are responsible for the category change in the brain. It's not the other way round. These word boundaries are in accord with cultural differences. We do not simply see a reality and give it names. What we see is shaped by the words we have for reality. Thinking is different. Another example is that there are effects that different languages have by applying gender to nouns, like le table or la table, whichever. A bridge in German, for example, will be beautiful or elegant, feminine. In Spanish, that same bridge will be strong or long, masculine. The noun in German is, of course, feminine, and in Spanish it's male. And perhaps this finds concrete expression in the elegant nature of German engineering, something shared across cultures. To move on, when an accident occurs in England, it's possible to say, for example, he broke the vase. A Spaniard would say, the vase broke. In English, it's possible to say, I broke my arm. Or maybe your arm broke, but you didn't do it, did you? This English implies some sort of purpose to the occurrence, as if a natural occurrence needs human input before it can even happen. To say you broke your arm in many languages would be to make you out a right nutter. One of the consequences flowing from the construction of the language here is that the Spaniard is more likely to forget who was involved in the accident. But he'll remember that it was an accident. The Englishman, in contrast, will remember who did it, and probably forget that it was an accident altogether. This has been researched. The consequence here is that depending on what you are told about the same event, and even if you witness the event for yourself, you will be more likely to punish the person if they broke the vase, and less so if it was an accident. We judge according to our language. What does that say of our thinking? So there are the big effects which flow from linguistics, such as how we see time. And there are the deep effects, such as the adoption of number words. And there are the earlier or immediate effects that language has on our perception, with colour, for example. And then there are the broad effects, like when nouns are given gender, in how we innately impose values upon anything which we can name. And finally, then, there are the weighty effects where we can impose blame, judgment, and punishment on our fellow human beings as a consequence of our language, of the words that we hear. Boroditsky, in her beautifully presented talk, points out that we are likely to lose half of the languages that we use now within 100 years, and that the language of study remains the property of usually English-speaking undergraduates at university. There's an argument for keeping the diversity, as what we know about the human mind is either very narrow or culturally based and is certainly next to nothing, so we could do better. Knowing what we do about the different linguistic landscapes and how language affects the way people think is an invitation to each of us to ask how language shapes what we think personally and how we think the way that we do, and to ask how we can think differently, and to ask what else our thoughts could be creating. So language guides how we think, and if this is the case, then we need to be careful about how we use it. And as I say, this awareness needs to extend, yes, into our language of research, but also through our day-to-day exchanges and into politics and into economics and everything else. I'm not arguing for controlling speech. This is a proper, serious argument for encouraging dialogue, for being able to take note of what we're habitually doing and judging it with open eyes so that we can act accordingly. And yes, if we are to be concerned with truth, then we need to be careful with it. So how does that pan out? Perhaps the only way we can get anywhere productive is to be aware of how to apply logical or critical thinking. And to do this requires a consistent and a reliable approach to language. I guess this is about being mindful of our language so that we can use it as a tool. We can take control of our own ideas we can take control of our own ideas. We don't have to let them control us. Look, one of the first points of linguistic carelessness or sloppiness can be found in logical fallacies. This is going to be a whole line of examples. Now, Wikipedia says a fallacy is the use of invalid or otherwise faulty reasoning or wrong moves in the construction of an argument. A fallacious argument may be deceptive by appearing to be better than it really is. And some fallacies are committed intentionally to manipulate or to persuade by deception, while others are committed unintentionally due to carelessness or ignorance. A fallacy can be seen to be an irrational product of subconscious habit, of errors of logic, of miscalculation and overgeneralization, like a cognitive bias. The difference between a fallacy and a cognitive bias lies in that a fallacy is used to construct an argument, to manipulate and control, whereas cognitive bias is essentially innocent but ingrained errors of thought, which lead to poor decision-making. There cannot fail to be a linguistic connection between the two, and it may be that if used habitually, a logical fallacy becomes ingrained as a heuristic and will express itself as a cognitive bias when decisions are to be made. Here, though, I'm just going to go on with a list of fallacies, examples straight out of a YouTube video. 31 logical fallacies in 8 minutes. To recap, logical fallacies are phrases that through habit and constant use have become part of the conversational toolbox. It's their common use that allows them to be named. Easy to slip into in the heat of the moment, and as you'll see, they're a major obstacle to creating understanding and cooperation between people. And yes, we're familiar with all of them. We use them ourselves and we get deflected by them time after time. The point is that if we aren't prepared to do the work to free ourselves from these linguistic traps, then we must be prepared to understand there are consequences. We've seen how closely our language is linked to how we think. Isn't it time we took our ideas back? Let's just take a look at these examples. First, the fallacy of composition. If it's true of the parts, then it must be true of the whole. Wrong. It doesn't follow that because you have good tyres, your car is good too. Then the fallacy of division. If it's true of the whole, then it must be true of the parts. Wrong again. Same mistake, but the opposite way around. Just because the car is good doesn't mean it has good tyres. That is whatever we want good to mean. Then there's the gambler's fallacy. The belief in streaks of good and bad luck. The belief in streaks of good and bad luck. Wrong. Scientifically, statistically, and categorically wrong. Then we have tu quoque, the fallacy that just because someone is no expert in what they're saying, doesn't mean it isn't true. It's Latin for who are you to talk. This leads us to straw manning, as featured with fair abundance in the mass media, which is about undermining an argument through personal attack, setting up your opponent in such a way as to be able to discredit them. In this way, their argument is defeated despite being true. Another example is someone saying, let's cut down on our use of fossil fuels. And then they're accused of something like, so you're saying that we should kill all old people this winter? Essentially painting the person into a corner. We're saying they're evil, don't listen to them. I mean, and yes, there's a name for that particular fallacy. The fallacy is known as ad hominem. Don't listen to that person, they're evil. Attack the person rather than the argument. But it doesn't mean their argument has any less weight. You lose. Of course, then we're able to discredit an argument because of where it comes from, the genetic fallacy. If we can't trust the messenger, then the news must be wrong. Well, wrong yourself. That isn't a logical conclusion that can be made, and there are the tactical, loaded questions designed to make the person answering the question look bad, to reduce their authority. When did you stop beating your wife, for example? And if we're at a point where authority is needed, why not quote the bloke down the road with a fallacious appeal to authority? Bring in an authority unrelated to the subject at hand. Yes, she may be an expert on lupin beetle, but that doesn't actually make her an expert on the problem at hand. Many of these go-to tactics or assumptions merely serve to distract, and the blatantly obvious red herring, or fallacy of distraction, is a well-known example. Just because someone's in tears doesn't mean he didn't do it. It's irrelevance. And at the same time, it's an appeal to your emotions, making you feel bad. Well, wrong again. Just because someone's sad and you're beginning to feel bad about a conclusion isn't enough to prove it wrong. Nor is the fact that everyone else is doing something. That's not proof it's right. The bandwagon fallacy. Nor an appeal to nature or to tradition. It's only natural, and we've been doing this for 1,000 years, do not in themselves prove something to be true or accurate. It is, however, worth saying here that just because something is being expressed in the form of a fallacy, that in itself is not enough to prove that it's inaccurate. You'll see how some of these overlap or act at the same time. Some of them you'll know by other names. How about an appeal to ignorance? If it can't be proved false, then it must be true. Wrong. Or claiming that the burden of proof lies with your opponent. There's no burden of proof. Or the false dichotomy of claiming that you have an absolute right on your side, so that anyone who disagrees must therefore be the spawn of the devil, must be evil, immoral, Satan. And with good and evil being on the same continuum, we could try, but it's impossible to distinguish one from the other. The Sorites, or decision point paradox. And it's not true, we can. And we can tell the difference between things even when they have the same noun, the same name. The law of gravity, for example, cannot be repealed. The laws of physics are different from the laws of the land. This is conflation of two different meanings, the same word. The fallacy of equivocation. And there are many, many more. I hope you've enjoyed those examples. I'm just about out of time and haven't really gone into the cave analogy as much as I would have liked. Enough to say, really, that we all get this matrix, cave, slavery thing. We all know something's up and could be better. We all want to be doing something but can't work out what it should be. Hopefully this just goes some way to pointing out how deep this stuff goes, all the way down into how what we think is dictated by what we say, and how what we say is mainly a subconscious regurgitation of what we hear. But if we're mindful of what we say and mindful of what we're told, that way freedom lies, and that way you can make a difference, starting right now. There is some hope.